Princess Valith Sarana had once been the most powerful woman in the Kethrani Empire, commanding fleets of warships and ruling over 3 star systems with grace and wisdom that made her people proud. But now she stood alone in a dirty spaceport on the edge of human territory, wearing torn clothes and carrying nothing but a small bag of supplies and the weight of her shattered life. Her brother Kalen had taken everything from her, and the memory of his cold eyes still burned in her mind like a wound that would never heal it. It had happened so quickly that she could barely believe it was real. And even now, standing in this strange place surrounded by aliens who hated her kind, she kept expecting to wake up from this nightmare. The crime they accused her of was simple, and in the eyes of the Kethrani High Council, it was unforgivable. She had refused to sign the order that would have destroyed an entire species on the outer rim. Those creatures were primitive and harmless, living in small villages and farming their land with simple tools, knowing nothing of the vast empire that had decided their fate. Kalen had wanted their planet for its minerals, and he had not cared that millions of innocent beings would die for his greed. Valith had stood before the council and spoken against the genocide, calling it wrong and evil, and beneath the honor of their ancestors. Her brother had smiled at her then, a terrible smile that she had never seen before, and he had called her weak in front of everyone. The council had agreed with him, voting to strip her of her titles and her lands and her name in the imperial records. They had given her 1 cycle to flee before the assassins came for her head. She had run like a frightened animal, stealing a small shuttle and jumping through space until she reached the station called Haven's Rest, a place where humans gathered to trade and drink and hide from their own troubles. The Kethrani were not welcome here, and she knew it from the moment she stepped off her shuttle. Humans had fought her people during the border wars, and they had lost millions of their kind to Kethrani weapons and Kethrani cruelty. Every human on this station had a reason to hate her silver skin, and her violet eyes and everything she represented. Valith pulled her hood lower and tried to disappear into the crowds. But it was hard to hide when you stood taller than most beings and glowed faintly in the dim light of the corridors. She found a cantina in a quiet corner of the station, a dark place filled with smoke and loud music and rough-looking creatures from a dozen different worlds. She ordered a drink she could not taste and sat in a booth near the back, hoping that no one would notice her. That hope died within the hour. 3 mercenaries approached her table, their heavy boots making the floor shake with each step. They were humans, big and scarred and armed with weapons that hung from their belts like trophies. The leader was a man with a shaved head and cruel eyes, and he grinned at her with teeth that had been filed to points. Well, he said in a voice that made her skin crawl. Looks like we found ourselves a princess. He had recognized the faded imperial markings on her travel cloak, the one she had been too tired to remove when she fled her home. The bounty on your head is enough to buy a small moon, the mercenary continued, leaning closer until she could smell the alcohol on his breath. And your brother made it clear he does not care if we bring you back alive or dead. Valith felt her hearts pounding in her chest as terror gripped her body and froze her in place. She had no weapons and no allies and no hope of escape, and these men were going to hurt her before they killed her. She could see it in their eyes, the hunger and the hatred and the pleasure they took in her fear. Please, she whispered, hating herself for begging but unable to stop the word from leaving her lips. The mercenaries laughed at her, and the leader reached out to grab her arm. That was when a voice cut through the noise of the cantina like a blade through silk. Let her go. Valith looked up and saw a human standing behind the mercenaries, a man who did not look like much at first glance. He was not particularly tall or muscular, with brown hair that needed cutting and a worn jacket that had seen better days. His hands were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard for every meal he ate, but his eyes were steady and calm. showing no fear as he faced 3 armed men who could have killed him without breaking a sweat. "Walk away, friend," the leader of the mercenaries said without turning around. "This is none of your business. I am making it my business," the stranger replied in a quiet voice that carried more weight than any shout could have. "And I am only going to ask once more. Let her go." The mercenaries turned to face him then, spreading out to surround the foolish human who had chosen the wrong moment to play Harrow Valeth, wanted to tell him to run, to save himself because she was not worth dying for. But the words stuck in her throat. The leader of the mercenaries drew a knife from his belt, a wicked curved blade that gleamed in the dim light. "Your funeral," he said with another sharp-toothed grin. Then the stranger Mavad Veleth had never seen a human fight before. And what happened next changed everything. She thought she knew about these beings. The stranger flowed like water, ducking under the first swing and driving his elbow into the mercenary's throat with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent cantina. He spun without stopping, catching the second man's arm and twisting it until the joint snapped like a dry branch. The third mercenary managed to draw his weapon, but the stranger was already there, slamming the man's head into the edge of a table with enough force to knock him unconscious. The entire fight lasted 11 seconds. The maze. Stranger stood over the fallen mercenaries, breathing hard but unhurt, and then he turned to Valeth and offered her his hand. "Are you hungry?" he asked, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if he had not just risked his life for a stranger from an enemy. Valeth stared at him, unable to understand what she was seeing. No one had ever defended her without expecting something in return, and she did not know how to respond to kindness that asked for nothing. "My name is Danny Vance," the stranger said with a small smile that softened his weathered face. "And I know a place that serves decent food if you are interested." She took his hand and let him help her to her feet, feeling the warmth of his skin against her silver fingers. "Why?" she asked, because it was the only question that mattered. "Why would you help me?" Danny looked at her for a long moment, his eyes seeing something in her face that she could not name. "Because you look like you needed it," he said simply. "And because doing the right thing should not require a reason." He led her out of the cantina and into the crowded corridors of the station. And Valeth followed him because she had nowhere else to go, and because something in his voice made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not alone anymore. Danny Vance had not always been a cargo hauler, working the lonely routes between distant stars. And the ghosts of his past followed him wherever he went like shadows that refused to fade. He had served in the Terran Defense Corps during the last Kethrani incursion, fighting alongside brave men and women who believed in something greater than themselves on a frozen moon called Crestfall. He had watched his entire squad die under Kethrani weapons fire, holding his best friend's hand as the light faded from his eyes. Danny had survived by luck or fate or some cruel joke of the universe, and he had carried the guilt of that survival ever since. He had no love for the Kethrani people, and every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the silver ships descending from the sky to rain death upon his friends. But when he had looked into Veleth's eyes in that cantina, he had seen something that cut through his hatred and touched something deeper inside him, had seen the hollow stare of someone who had lost everything. And he had recognized it because he saw the same look in the mirror every morning now. He walked beside her through the crowded station, leading her toward the docking bay where his ship waited. "Where are we going?" Valeth asked in her musical voice, her long legs easily matching his pace despite her exhaustion. "My ship," Danny replied, glancing around to make sure no one was following them. "It is not much, but it is safe. And we can figure out what to do next once we get there." The Rusty Comet sat in berth 17, a battered cargo hauler that had seen better decades and wore its scars with something like pride. The hull was patched in a dozen places. The paint had faded to an ugly gray-brown color, and one of the landing struts had a permanent wobble that Danny had never gotten around to fixing. But the engines were solid, and the life support worked most of the time. And it was the only home Danny had known since leaving the military. He led Valith up the boarding ramp and into the narrow corridors of the ship. And he had barely closed the outer door when a voice rang out from deeper inside. "Danny Vance, you better have a good explanation for being 3 hours late. Because I swear, if you spend all our fuel money on drinks again, I will personally throw you out the airlock." A woman appeared from the engine room, wiping grease from her hands with a dirty rag and glaring at Danny with eyes that could have melted steel. She was short and fierce, with dark hair cut close to her skull and muscles. Built from years of wrestling with stubborn machinery, her name was Grace Holloway. And she had been Danny's partner and friend since. They had both washed out of their old lives and found each other at the bottom of a bottle. Grace stopped mid-stride when she saw Velez standing behind Danny, and her expression shifted from annoyance to shock to fury in the space of a heartbeat. "You brought a Kethrani onto our ship?" she demanded, her voice rising with each word. "Have you completely lost your mind?" "Grace, listen to me," Danny said in his calm and steady voice. "She needed help, and I was not going to leave her to those bounty hunters. She is one of them." Grace shouted, pointing at Valith with a trembling finger. "Our people killed millions of us, Danny, or have you forgotten what happened on Crestfall?" "I have not forgotten," Danny said quietly, and something in his tone made Grace pause. "I will never forget, and I will carry those memories until the day I die. But this woman is not the enemy, Grace. She is a refugee running for her life, just like we were once." Grace looked at Valith with eyes full of pain and hatred, and something that might have been fear. Valith lowered her head, unable to meet the human woman's gaze, because she knew that Grace was right to hate her kind. "I am sorry," Valith said softly. "I know what my people have done, and I carry the shame of it with me always. But I swear to you that I never wanted any of it. And I tried to stop them when I could." "You tried to stop them?" Grace laughed bitterly. "You expect me to believe that a Kethrani princess actually cared about human lives?" "I tried to stop a genocide," Valith replied, lifting her head to meet Grace's eyes. "That is why they exiled me. That is why my own brother wants me dead, because I refused to sign an order that would have killed millions of innocent beings." Grace stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of deception. Danny watched them both, saying nothing, trusting them to find their own way through the pain and anger that hung in the air like smoke. Finally, Grace let out a long breath and shook her head. "Fine," she said in a voice that was still hard, but no longer quite so hostile. "She can stay for tonight, but if she causes any trouble, I am feeding her to the nearest star." "Thank you," Valith whispered, and she meant it with all of her heart. Over the following weeks, Valith learned what it meant to live among humans. She learned that Danny and Grace argued constantly about everything from engine maintenance to meal choices, but that their arguments never lasted long and always ended with forgiveness. She learned that Grace's harsh words hid a fierce loyalty that she showed through actions rather than speeches. Fixing Valith's torn cloak without being asked and leaving extra food in places where she would find it. She learned that Danny smiled rarely, but when he did, it transformed his weathered face into something almost gentle, something that made her heart beat faster in ways she did not understand. Valith told them her story in pieces, sharing a little more each night as they sat together in the ship's small common room. She told them about the empire she had tried to reform from within, fighting against traditions of cruelty and conquest that stretched back thousands of years. She told them about the atrocities she had tried to prevent, the world she had saved by arguing and pleading and sometimes threatening those who would have destroyed them. She told them about her brother Kalen, who had once been a kind and gentle boy before their father's death had twisted him into Something monstrous. Danny and Grace listened without judgment, asking questions sometimes but never demanding more than she was willing to give for the first time in her life. Valeth was not a symbol or a tool to be used for political. Genshi was simply a person sharing meals and stories in quiet moments with friends, but the galaxy would not let her hide. Forever the rusty comet was docked at a trading post when the news came through on every channel. A broadcast from the Kethrani Empire that made Velith's blood run colder. Brother had dispatched his most ruthless enforcer to retrieve her, Commander Rethys, the Blade of the Empire, a warrior who had never failed to capture his target in 500 years of service, had been Velith's guardian when she was a child, teaching her to fight and to think and to survive in the deadly world of imperial politics. He knew her better than anyone alive, and he would track her across the stars no matter where she tried to hide. "We need to run," Grace said urgently. Already moving toward the engine room, Danny put a hand on Violet's shoulder, his touch warm and grounding. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you are not alone anymore." Valeth looked into his eyes and wanted to believe him, but she knew that Rethys was coming, and she knew that no one had ever escaped him. Commander Rethys arrived at Haven's Rest 3 days later, his massive warship appearing in the station space like a predator, emerging from the shadows to claim its prey. The ship was called the Eternal Fury, and it bristled with weapons that could have turned the entire station into dust with a single volley. 100 soldiers marched through the docking bay in perfect formation, their silver armor gleaming under the harsh lights as humans scrambled to get out of their way. The station administrators had no choice but to allow Rethys to search for the fugitive princess, because refusing him would have meant death for everyone aboard. Danny watched the soldiers from a hidden alcove near the cargo bay, his jaw tight with tension as he counted the weapons and calculated their odds. "This is bad," Grace whispered beside him, her face pale in the emergency lighting they had switched to when the alarm started. "We cannot fight 100 Kethrani soldiers, Danny. We need to run. The station is locked down," Danny replied grimly. "No ships in or out until Rethys finishes his search." They had hidden Valeth in a smuggler's compartment behind the engine room, a secret space that Danny had used to transport contraband during harder times. It was cramped and hot and barely big enough for one person, but it was invisible to standard scanning equipment, and it was their only hope. "He will find her," Grace said, and there was fear in her voice that Danny had never heard before. "You did not see what the Kethrani did during the war, Danny. You did not see the way they hunted down everyone who tried to hide." "I saw enough," Danny said quietly, "and I am not going to let them take her." The search teams moved through the station section by section, checking every ship and every room and every hiding place they could find. Danny and Grace returned to the rusty comet and waited, trying to look like innocent cargo haulers who had nothing to fear from the Kethrani Empire. But Rethys was not fooled by their act, came aboard their ship personally, ducking his tall frame through the narrow doorways and scanning the interior with eyes that had seen 1,000 deceptions. He was ancient, even by Kethrani standards, his silver skin marked with scars from centuries of battle, his movements carrying the deadly grace of a warrior who had forgotten more about killing than most beings would ever learn. 6 elite guards followed him, their weapons raised and ready, their faces hidden behind helmets that showed no emotion. "You are Danny Vance," Rethys said, in a voice like grinding stone. "A former soldier in the Terran Defense Corps, survivor of the Crestfall massacre, now working as a cargo hauler on the Outer Rim." Danny felt ice run through his veins at the mention of Crestfall, but he kept his face calm. "That is right," he said steadily. "And you are on my ship without permission." "Commander," Rethys studied him with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to see the secrets hidden underneath. "I am looking for Princess Velith Sorana," he said, And I believe you know where she is. Never heard of her, Danny lied. Knowing even as he spoke that Rethus would not believe him, the commander smiled then. A thin and humorless expression that made Danny's skin crawl. You are brave for a human, Rethus said. The bravery will not save you or the princess, because I have been hunting fugitives since before your species learned to walk upright, and no one has ever escaped me. He signaled to his guards, and they began tearing apart the ship, ripping open panels and overturning cargo containers and destroying everything Danny and Grace had worked to build. Grace grabbed a plasma torch from her workbench and held it like a weapon, her eyes blazing with fury. You have no right to do this, she shouted at the guards. This is a human vessel in human space. One of the guards backhanded her across the face, sending her stumbling against the wall with blood dripping from her lips. Something snapped inside Danny. He moved before he could think, crossing the distance between himself and the guard in 2 quick steps and driving his fist into the weak point beneath the soldier's helmet. The guard went down hard, and Danny spun to face the others, his body falling into a fighting stance that he had never forgotten despite all the years since the war. That is enough, he shouted, his voice ringing through the ship. You want to search, then search, but you do not touch my crew again. The guards raised their weapons to kill him, but Rethus held up one hand and they froze in place. Interesting, the commander said, tilting his head as he examined Danny with new curiosity. You would die for this Kethrani princess, human? She is my friend, Danny replied without hesitation. And yes, I would die for her. Why? Rethus asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like genuine curiosity. She is not of your kind. She is descended from the very people who slaughtered your companions on Crestfall. So why would you sacrifice yourself for her? Danny thought about the question for a long moment before he answered, because she tried to stop a genocide. He said finally, because she lost everything for standing up against evil, and because some things are worth dying for. Even when there is no hope of winning, Rethus stood perfectly still, his ancient eyes fixed on Danny's face as if searching for something that he had lost long ago. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight to the point of breaking. I served the royal house of Serana for 500 years, Rethus said slowly. I watched Valeth grow from a child into a woman of conscience and courage, and I saw her weep when she learned of the suffering her people had caused. He paused, and Danny could see some kind of battle happening behind those silver eyes. Her brother is a monster, Rethus continued in a voice so quiet that even the guards could barely hear him. He has twisted everything our empire once stood for into something dark and cruel. And I have followed his orders because that is what I was trained to do. He turned to look at Grace, who still clutched her plasma torch with blood running down her chin, and then back at Danny, who stood ready to fight and die for a woman he had known for only a few weeks. I have seen many things in my centuries of service, Rethus said, but I have never seen a human willing to die for a Kethrani. He made a decision in that moment, and Danny could see it happen, could see the weight lift from the old warrior's shoulders as he finally chose to stop following orders that violated everything. He believed Imrithus turned to his guards and spoke in a commanding voice that left no room for argument. The princess is not aboard this vessel, he said. We will continue our search elsewhere. The guards looked at each other in confusion, but they did not dare to question their commander. They filed out of the ship one by one, leaving the wreckage of their search behind them. Rethus paused at the doorway and looked back at Danny one last time. Take care of her, he said quietly. She deserves better than what her family has given her. Then he was gone, marching back to his warship with his soldiers following in perfect formation. Danny waited until the Eternal Fury had left the station before he opened the smuggler's Compartment Velith emerged with tears streaming down her silver face. And he knew that she had heard every word through the thin walls. "He saved us," she whispered. "Rethis saved us, and my brother will kill him for it." Danny put his arms around her and held her as she wept for the old warrior who had chosen honor over duty. "Then we will make sure his sacrifice means something," Danny said softly. "We will make sure it counts." Grace watched them from across the room, still holding her plasma torch, and for the first time since Velith had come aboard, there was no hatred in her eyes. There was only determination and the beginning of something that might become respect. The news of Commander Rethis spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried on every communication channel, and whispered in every cantina from the core worlds to the Outer Rim. Emperor Kalen had executed his most loyal servant publicly, broadcasting the death to every corner of his empire as a warning to anyone who might consider showing mercy to his enemies. Rethis had faced the execution with dignity, refusing to beg or plead, his ancient eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls of the throne room. Where he died, Velith watched the recording only once. And then she locked herself in her quarters for 3 days while grief tore through her like a storm. Danny brought her food and water, sitting outside her door and talking to her through the metal, even when she would not answer. He told her about his life before the war, about the small town on Earth where he had grown up, about his mother who had taught him to fight and his father who had taught him to be kind. He told her about Crestfall and the friends he had lost, about the guilt he carried and the nightmares that still woke him in the dark hours of the night. He told her that grief was not weakness, and that the pain she felt was proof that she had loved someone worth loving. On the 4th day, Velith emerged from her quarters with dry eyes and a new fire burning in her heart. "My brother killed the only father figure I had left," she said in a voice that was cold and hard as steel. "And I am going to make him pay for it." Danny looked at her for a long moment, seeing the change that had come over her. The transformation from a frightened refugee into something else entirely. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, and Velith smiled then, and it was not a gentle smile. "I'm going to take his empire away from him," she said, "piece by piece, until there is nothing left but ashes and memory." They started small, because that was all they could manage with one battered cargo ship and a crew of 3. Danny reached out to old contacts from his military days, people he had served with who had grown tired of watching the galaxy burn under Kithrani oppression. Grace called in favors from the engineering guild, mechanics and technicians who had lost family to Imperial raids and were looking for a way to fight back within weeks. They had assembled a ragged coalition of smugglers, refugees, and disillusioned soldiers who had nothing left to lose. They met on a hidden asteroid base that had once been a pirate haven. 100 people from a dozen different species, crowded into a space designed for 50 Danny, stood before them and spoke, not of glory or revenge or the righteousness of their cause, but of something simpler and more powerful. "We all have reasons to hate the Kithrani Empire," he said, his voice carrying through the cramped chamber. "We have all lost people we loved, and we have all dreamed of seeing Kalen pay for what he has done." He paused, looking at the faces around him, seeing the anger and the fear and the desperate hope that flickered in their eyes. "But this is not about revenge," Danny continued. "This is about building something better, something that will last after the fighting is done. Because if all we do is tear down the Empire without building something to replace it, then we are no better than the tyrants we are trying to defeat." A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, while others frowned with skepticism. Human woman pushed her way to the front of the gathering, tall and lean, with red hair cut short and scars that crossed her face like a map of past battles. Her name was Katie Brennan, and she commanded a privateer vessel called the Red Dawn that had been raiding Kithrani supply lines for years. "Pretty words," Katie said in a sharp voice that demanded attention. "But I want to hear from the princess." not her human pet. The crowd shifted, turning their attention to Velith, who stood quietly at Danny's side. Katie walked toward her, stopping close enough that they could have touched. Her green eyes hard with suspicion and old hatred. "Why should we trust you?" Katie demanded. "You are still Kethrani. Your people have enslaved billions and destroyed worlds without mercy. And your own brother sits on a throne built from the bones of innocence." Velith did not flinch or look away from Katie's accusing gaze. "You are right to question me," she said calmly. "I was raised in privilege and ignorance, surrounded by luxury, while my people committed atrocities in my name. And the guilt of my heritage will haunt me until the day I die." She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger. "I cannot change what my family has done," Velith continued. "I cannot bring back the dead or heal the wounds that the Empire has inflicted on the galaxy. But I can offer you everything I know about Imperial defenses, about fleet movements and supply routes and the weaknesses in Callan's armor." She held out her hands, palms up in a gesture of surrender. "I am not asking you to forgive me or my people," she said. "I am asking for the chance to fight beside you, to risk my life the same as anyone else, and to prove through my actions that I am worthy of your trust." Katie studied her for a long moment, her eyes searching Velith's face for any sign of deception. The room was silent, everyone waiting to see what the fierce privateer captain would decide. Finally, Katie extended her hand, rough and calloused from years of shipwork, and grasped Velith's silver fingers in a firm grip. "Welcome to the rebellion," she said, and something like a smile flickered across her scarred face. The coalition grew stronger in the months that followed, gaining new members with every raid and every victory they won against the Empire. They struck supply convoys, stealing food and medicine that they distributed to worlds suffering under Kethrani occupation. They liberated prison colonies, freeing thousands of political prisoners who joined their cause with grateful hearts. They broadcast messages to the oppressed worlds of the Empire, promising that change was coming, that they were not alone. That hope was still alive in the darkness between the stars. Velith proved her worth again and again, using her knowledge of Imperial tactics to plan attacks that left Callan's commanders confused and humiliated. She fought alongside the others in boarding actions, her royal training making her deadly in close combat, her courage inspiring those who had once hated her kind. And through it all, Danny stayed at her side, a steadfast presence in the chaos of their desperate war. She had begun to feel something she had never expected, something that frightened her almost as much as her brother's assassins. She had begun to feel hope late one night, as the fleet gathered in a hidden nebula to prepare for their greatest battle yet. Velith found Danny alone on the observation deck of the rusty comet. He was staring out at the stars, his face lit by the distant light of 1,000 suns. And she came to stand beside him without speaking. "Scared?" he asked after a while, not looking away from the view. "Terrified," she admitted, "but not of dying. I am scared that we will fail, that everything we have built will be destroyed, and that Callan will win." Danny turned to face her then, his brown eyes warm in the starlight. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said softly, "know that I am glad I walked into that cantina, and I am glad I met you." Velith felt her heart beating faster as she looked at him. This quiet human who had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. "Danny," she said, and then stopped, not knowing how to express what she was feeling. He smiled his rare smile and took her hand in his. "I know," he said. "Me too." They stood together in the silence, two unlikely companions on the edge of a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. And in that moment, Velith knew that whatever came next, she would face it without fear, because she was not alone anymore. Emperor Callan brought his grand fleet to crush the rebellion. 1,000 warships carrying enough firepower to burn entire worlds to cinders. He had grown tired of watching his convoys raided and his prisons emptied. Tired of hearing reports of hope spreading through the subjugated worlds like a disease that would not stop, his message to the galaxy was clear and brutal. Mercy was weakness, and the Kethrani Empire would suffer no weakness to exist. The rebel fleet was outnumbered 5-1. Their ships old and patched together from salvage. Their crews exhausted from months of constant fighting, they gathered in the shadow of a gas giant, using its magnetic field to hide their signatures while they prepared for the battle that would decide everything. Vailith stood on the bridge of Katie's ship, the Red Dawn, looking out at the small fleet that had chosen to follow her into what might be their final hours. Danny was out there somewhere in a battered interceptor. He had modified himself, ready to fly into the teeth of the Imperial formation. Grace was aboard the rusty Comet with a skeleton crew, keeping the old ship running through pure stubbornness and creative swearing. So many others had joined them, humans and aliens from every corner of the galaxy, united by nothing except the shared dream of something better. Velith activated the communication system and began to speak, a voice carrying to every ship in the fleet. "I know that many of you have reasons to hate me and my kind," she said. "I know that the Kethrani Empire has taken everything from some of you, families and homes and futures that can never be restored." She paused, feeling the weight of every eye and ear turned toward her words. "I am not going to promise you victory today," Vailith continued. "I am not going to tell you that we will all survive what comes next, because we are facing the most powerful military force in the galaxy, and the odds are not in our favor." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "But I am going to tell you why we are here, why we are fighting, and why what we do today matters even if we fall." She thought of Rethus, who had sacrificed everything for honor. She thought of Danny, who had taught her what it meant to stand beside someone, no matter the cost. She thought of all the worlds burning under her brother's cruelty, all the innocent lives crushed beneath the weight of an empire that had forgotten compassion. "We are here because someone has to say no," Vailith said. "Someone has to stand up and declare that there are lines that should not be crossed, that power does not justify evil, and that even the smallest flame of hope can light the way through the darkest night." She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "Today, we fight not for revenge or glory, but for every person who has ever looked at the stars and dreamed of freedom, and win or lose. The galaxy will remember that we did not go quietly into the dark. The battle began minutes later, and it was unlike anything Vailith had ever seen. Ships burned in the void as weapons. Fire crisscrossed the space between the fleets, painting the darkness with streaks of light and flame. The rebel ships were faster and more maneuverable than the Imperial warships, dancing around the larger vessels and striking at weak points before retreating to safety. Danny flew his interceptor like a man possessed, weaving through enemy formations and drawing fire away from the slower transports. Vailith watched his ship on the tactical display, her heart's clenching every time he disappeared behind an explosion or dove into a cloud of debris. The rusty Comet took a direct hit that should have torn it apart, but Grace somehow kept the engines running, and the old ship limped out of the fire to continue the fight. Katie commanded her ship with cold precision, coordinating the rebel fleet through the chaos with a voice that never wavered. Hours passed, and the casualties mounted on both sides. But the rebel fleet held together through determination and desperation, and the knowledge that there was no retreat. Then Danny made his move. His interceptor broke away from the main battle and dove straight toward Kellen's flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Throne of Stars that sat at the center of the Imperial formation. He was drawing fire from a dozen ships, his small craft spinning and rolling to avoid the weapons that reached for him like hungry hands. "Danny, what are you doing?" Vailith shouted into the communication channel, her voice cracking with fear. "Opening a path," he replied. and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Get your boarding party ready, because you have about 30 seconds before that opening closes." Katie understood immediately, ordering her ship to follow in Danny's wake. Racing through the gap he was creating with his reckless flight, they reached the flagship just as Danny's interceptor took a hit. That sent it spinning into the darkness. Trailing smoke and fire, Velith screamed his name, but there was no time for grief, because the airlock was cycling open and the battle for the Emperor's ship had begun. She led the boarding party through corridors slick with blood and smoke, fighting through elite guards who had sworn to die before letting enemies reach their master. Katie fought beside her, the two women covering each other like they had trained together for years instead of months. The path to the throne room was paved with bodies, and when the doors finally opened, Velith faced her brother. Alonakilan stood before his throne, his silver armor gleaming, his eyes filled with contempt and hatred for the sister who had dared to challenge him. "You think you can take my empire from me?" he asked, his voice dripping with scorn. "You are nothing but a traitor and a fool who surrounds herself with human insects." Velith did not answer with words. She drew her blade and attacked, and their fight shook the walls of the throne room. With its Fori, Kalan was strong and skilled, trained by the same masters who had taught Velith. But he fought with anger while she fought with purpose. Their blades clashed again and again, sparks flying with each contact, until finally Velith found an opening and drove her sword through her brother's chest. Kalan looked at her with shock and disbelief, his mouth opening to speak words that never came. Then he fell, and the Empire fell with him. The war was not over in that moment, because empires do not crumble in a day. But the tide had turned in a way that could not be reversed. Velith stood over her brother's body and felt nothing but sorrow for the boy he had once been, before power and fear had twisted him into a monster. Hours later, when the fighting was done and the Imperial fleet had surrendered, Velith found Danny in the medical bay of a rescue ship. His interceptor had crashed into the flagship's hull, and he had dragged himself through a breach in the armor to continue fighting, even with broken ribs and blood covering his face. Grace sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes red from tears she would never admit to shedding. Danny looked up when Velith entered, and despite everything, he managed to smile his rare smile. "We won?" he asked in a voice rough with pain. Velith sat on the edge of his bed and took his other hand in hers. "We won," she said softly, "and it was because of you. All of this was because a human cargo hauler decided to stand up in a cantina and defend a stranger." Danny squeezed her hand weakly. "I would do it again," he said. 1,000 times over. The galaxy would heal slowly in the years to come, old wounds closing as new alliances formed between species that had once been enemies. Velith took the throne of the reformed empire, not as a conqueror, but as a servant of her people, working to undo the damage her family had caused. Danny stayed at her side, not as a consort or a general, but as a friend who reminded her every day why the work mattered. And in the vast darkness between the stars, hope burned like a quiet flame that would never go out. The end.